that's what I mean when I say it traverses. My job, ethically, is to ask where in this face is the ethical demand of the other. Let's take capital punishment, which is alive and well in the United States of America. The face of the condemned person presented before a court of law. What does that judge see when he looks at that face? Maybe he says, oh, this is the face of a murderer. Maybe. But is this not also another who calls to me and to whom I am obligated?
I'm sorry for not doing justice to the entirety of your work. We only have 2 hours.
We don't do justice. We can't do justice.
But giving an account of oneself. There I would like to touch on 2 influences or 2 figures that you discuss in relationship to ethics and narrative. The first is Levinas. It's central to your account of ethics and this the face of the other and the imperative of the face of the other of not killing would be, part of this ideal world that we're imagining, but it's not happening. Even though I admire his move from ontology to ethics, I always felt his big other abstract. We spoke of address and identification and interpolation, and when I imagine the face of the other, it's always an individual face with a particular voice, particular pathos that we can be trained or not trained to recognize as somebody that I recognize as a face in the first place.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could talk about the phenomenological encounter of a face of other with small o.
Well, there's a small o and the big O. The shadow of the big O passes over the face of the small o. Mm-hmm. So analytically we distinguish them, but in fact they cross each other all the time. At one point, Levinas says that the face doesn't have to be a face, it can be a neck, it can be a sound of a voice. Mm-hmm. So the face is a figure for him. It is the figure for the call from the other, or what he calls a demand from the other, an ethical obligation that is being directed towards. So I pass somebody on the street who's homeless or in a state of destitution. I pass by. Do I pass by? Do I stop? Has that person called to me, even if they are sitting in silence? The face of the other operates at that moment, even if that face cannot be seen. Let's say that face is buried, or I can't find that face. So the empirical face is not really necessary for the face of the other. Similarly, if we were to say, well, only certain kinds of faces really call to us, let's say white privileged people, or people who conform to their gender, or people from the northern hemisphere, or we can imagine all kinds of ways in which certain faces are privileged. That's important to note sociologically, politically, whose face matters. If a face, and now that we have all this facial recognition hardware at airports, it feels very frightening. The kind of surveillance that is done, the racial profiling that is done, who gets pulled out of line, who's stopped from flying. So there are all kinds of reasons to be skeptical of using the empirical face as the basis of an ethical relationship. But if the face is a figure for demand, then no empirical face, no matter how privileged, no matter how normative, can ever represent the face of the other. In other words, the face of the other passes through or over the empirical face. So if I fail to recognize somebody because of their gender, their race, their background, their ability, disability, something like that, I am trapped by the empirical. I am ensnared by the empirical, and I cannot be ethical from that position. In fact, I have to allow a kind of ethical question, an ethical demand to emerge from any possible face. And that's what I mean when I say it traverses. My job, ethically, is to ask where in this face is the ethical demand of the other. Let's take capital punishment, which is alive and well in the United States of America. The face of the condemned person presented before a court of law. What does that judge see when he looks at that face? Maybe he says, oh, this is the face of a murderer. maybe. But is this not also another who calls to me and to whom I am obligated? Now, the argument against the death penalty is that you don't let the so-called face of that person become the face of the murderer. It always must also be the face that calls to me to honor an ethical obligation. So even in the face of the murderer, there must be that other face. And so it keeps us from collapsing into the specificity of that face. And it keeps us alert to the fact that even if we are prejudiced or don't want to look at that face or already hate that person, we are obligated to see something there that goes beyond what our empirical perception is tending to see. That's how I understand it. It's actually a way of cutting our prejudice, like stopping our prejudice from being able to capture the face of the other. It might even be anti-surveillance.
One of the reasons that motivated my question was the fact that, focusing on mimesis, I've been interested in what happens in neuroscience, not so much to find an empirical answer to the ethical question, but there are interesting hypotheses that confirm what we've been talking about, the innate relationality or intersubjectivity or whatever we want to call it, that we respond to facial expression. We have neurons in the brain that are activated by the facial expression of the other, whether we want it or not, subliminally, but that is not a determinism because it's also shaped by culture and education and the type of faces that are recognized.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
I know that there's a psychological theory offered by, I believe his name is Daniel Stern, who believes that the face is an a priori structure in the mind of the child. Right. But I don't know how he would prove that.
It's not him I had in mind,
okay.
but neuroscientists who are interested in phenomenology, and I have seen your work going back to phenomenology and the pandemic book, Merleau-Ponty and so forth. So these are readers of Merleau-Ponty. Vittorio Gallese is an Italian neuroscientist who was part of the team that discovered these mirror neurons, these neurons that are activated when they're motor neurons, so responsible for movement. They're activated if I grab a coffee, but if I see you drink or making that movement, they will activate also. And the hypothesis is that they do play a role in things like imitation or empathy, feeling the affects of the other in a non-mediated, pre-linguistic ways. Now I can see why we trained in the Humanities can be reluctant of that empirical kind of reduction to what happens at the neuronal level, because we are complicated creatures, socially constituted. But at the same time, what I found interesting is that this, at least the philosophically informed neuroscientists, they do acknowledge the role of experience. They do acknowledge the role of culture. They
sure. So there are interactive models.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So for that reason, being aware of effect of the faces that we encounter, of the genders we see and the race that we identify, might be a starting point from the bottom up. To train ourselves by techniques of kind of recognition of the humanity of the other, independently of the other small group.
Yes, but you see here, going back to the face as figure, I think we have to be wary of a certain ocular centrism, right? Because the unsighted don't have the face, they have the sound. And the child also has the sound.
Right.
And it seems to me that we underestimate the other senses when sight is considered to be the privileged one. So what is the voice of the caretaker feel like or sound like? What is the touch? What is the smell? There's an entire sensorium that I think comes with early childhood that it doesn't necessarily have sight as its most important moment. It's certainly there. I have no doubt about that. But remember, even Levinas says the face of the other can be the sound of a voice. I don't underestimate the interesting and productive character of neurological research, but perhaps it has to be directed towards all the senses.
I fully agree, especially when it comes to mimesis, the visual is always the dominant one.
Yes.
Apparently these mirror neurons are operative also with sound and touch and the entire kind of bodily sensorium.
Yes.
But yes, thanks for emphasizing voice, because it's a perfect transition to the other influence or presence in giving an account of oneself that I wanted to briefly touch upon is Adriana Cavallero. I come from the Italian part of it, and it's just an aside. But
I see.
But I discovered Adriana Cavallero, who lives in Verona, not far from where I live, thanks to giving an account of oneself. So thank you very much.
Okay. I see. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. You emphasize a role in stressing a figure of the self that is exposed to the other. You share a certain interest in Arendt, feminism,
Sure.
but you come from very different feminist traditions.
Yes.
And so for me it's always nice to see intellectuals that speak across those internal divisions. What led you to Adriana Cavallero's work and giving an account of oneself? It's about the role of narrative in a certain sense, and the role of the other terms. I was wondering if you could contextualize that encounter between your work and Adriana Cavallero.
I mean, I remember first meeting her in Madrid about 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And she was speaking in Italian, and I was listening to a Spanish translation. But I did understand something, what she was saying, and it was a critique of Plato, which was extremely interesting to me. And I thought she had a vibrant way of engaging some of the key texts in the history of philosophy through a feminist lens. And we had dinner and we sang, and I think became quite fond of each other. So I followed her work on Hannah Arendt. I think her way of making the sphere of appearance into a contemporary concept of politics is extremely important. I followed her work on voice, on the choral nature of voice in political spheres, horrorism after 9/11, very interesting work on the spectacles of horror. So I've been in touch with her, and I've learned from her, and I feel a deep affinity with her as a thinker. And I always learn from her work on Hannah Arendt. There's no question in my mind. She leads me in many ways.
Very happy to see this collaboration, and also some of the recent books on assembly and
Yes. And of course, Thou Shalt Not Kill, her
Yes.
work on nonviolence. I loved that work, and I thought she worked with the commandments in a way that was very poignant. No question about it.
So with Adriana, we have been experimenting with the notion of inclinations, which
Yes,
is
I know.
her recent books.
I wrote something on it.
I asked her if she would agree to call it, because of my obsession, mimetic inclination, because she speaks of this posture that is relational, and you speak of a complicated form of mimesis in relationship to the question of who are you, the question of the who.
Keeping the question open.
Yes, and I was wondering if you can say something about that complicated form of mimesis. Is it always the same in the work on giving an account of oneself?
Well, there's something that poses a problem for ethics, which is, what is sometimes called mimetic closure. Now, mimetic closure in my mind is when one posture, gesture, position is replicated exactly, and then it's over. In Derrida's idea of iterability, there's a repetition, but there's always a repetition with a difference, right? So the notion of différence, at least in the Derridian sense, and maybe even differenza in Caballero sense, departs from mimesis, or might be said to be the underside of mimesis that is not always acknowledged when mimesis leads to closure. So as a repetition takes place, say, of a gesture or of a voice or even of a principle or position, as a repetition takes place, it's not exactly like what it was before. So we have to set the idea of similitude aside. It's not a perfect replication. And earlier I was talking about a failed repetition or an imperfect repetition. Well, there is that différence that happens in every mimetic reproduction, which makes the second or the third iteration different from the first. And without that difference, we do have a total or closed mimesis, or a kind of totality. It doesn't permit of change, or doesn't permit of innovation, or even subversion or opposition. And I suppose for Caballero, as I understand her, there's a primacy to difference, like sexual difference, that cannot be overcome, right? So there can be no complete or successful mimesis of the masculine of the feminine, or the feminine of the masculine. That to do that would erase this fundamental difference. And she takes that difference to be a condition of ethical relationality. Now, I don't see sexual difference as the condition of ethical relationality. So I depart from Irigaray, but I also depart from Caballero on that point. But I do take differences in the plural of many kind to be a condition of ethical relationality. And I also accept from her work this wonderful way of talking about singularity. But for me, singularity means, yes, we now have a gender field that includes trans and non-conforming and non-binary and all kinds of people who are singular within an interrelated field. And their struggles belong with the struggle for reproductive freedom. Their struggles belong to the struggle against violence. Their struggles even belong to the struggles against destructive forces like capitalism, climate change, and war. So my tent is larger. And sexual difference is but one difference. And not everybody falls on one side or the other, not even at birth. So we need to have a heart that's open enough to accept the different paths, and in that way to affirm the singularities that are as interrelated, as part of who we are. So I think I'm still in a Caballero world, but I just lay the emphasis in a different place.
And this dialogue is very important, allows for different feminisms to speak.
I think we are going to have a conversation. Right now it seems like it's April 30th. That will happen in Verona or somewhere near.
Okay, I'll ask her, so maybe we'll be there.